Think about the last time you paid your taxes. Maybe you grumbled. Maybe you opened a laptop, filled out some forms, transferred some money. It wasn't pleasant, but nobody showed up at your door with armed guards and a list of everything you own. Now imagine this. A man on horseback rides into your village. He is better dressed than anyone you've ever met. He has a parchment scroll with your name on it, and he has the legal authority to take your best cow, your stored grain, the shirt off your back, and, if you can't pay, your freedom. That was Tuesday in medieval England. If you are using this to fall asleep, perfect. The tax collector left 700 years ago. He is not coming back tonight. Subscribe and stick around. Tonight we're going to explore something that shaped the lives of millions of ordinary people across medieval Europe. Not the kings and their wars, not the knights and their tournaments. The thing that medieval peasants actually thought about every day. The thing that kept them awake at night. The thing that could mean the difference between surviving the winter and watching your children starve. Taxes. And here is the thing that makes medieval taxation genuinely horrifying from a modern perspective. It wasn't one tax. It wasn't even 2 or 3 taxes. It was an endless, overlapping, sometimes contradictory web of obligations that reached into every aspect of a peasant's life. You were taxed when you harvested your crops. You were taxed when you sold an animal. You were taxed when your daughter got married. And you were taxed when you died. Let's start with the foundation. The feudal system itself. In medieval Europe, almost all land belonged to the king. The king granted large estates to his most powerful nobles, who granted smaller portions to lesser lords, who granted strips of farmland to the peasants, who actually worked it. At every level of this chain, something was owed upward, and at the very bottom, bearing the full accumulated weight of every obligation above them, were the peasants. There were 2 broad categories of peasant. Free tenants held their land by paying money rent and owed relatively few additional obligations. But the majority, the serfs or villeins, were bound to the land itself. They couldn't leave the manor without permission. They couldn't marry without permission. Technically, everything they owned, the clothes on their backs, the tools in their sheds, the animals in their pens, belonged to the lord. The distinction between free and unfree peasant was the great dividing line of medieval rural society. On any given manor, a lord might have both free and servile tenants living side by side, working the same fields, sharing the same village. But their obligations were vastly different. The freeman paid his rent and went about his business. The villein paid his rent, worked the lord's fields, paid fees for every significant life event, and bore the full weight of a system designed to extract as much value from him as humanly possible. And the obligations of a serf were staggering. Let's walk through them one by one, because when you see the full list, you start to understand why a medieval peasant hearing hoofbeats on the road felt a cold knot form in their stomach. First, there was the rent, a yearly payment to the lord for the right to farm your strip of land. This might be paid in coin, but more often in goods. A portion of your harvest, so many bushels of wheat, so many of barley. The amount varied from manor to manor, but it was always significant. The rent alone could claim a quarter of what you produced. Then there was the corvée, labor service. As a serf, you were required to work on the Lord's personal land, his demesne, for a set number of days each week. This varied, but 2 to 3 days per week was common, rising to 4 or 5 days during planting and harvest seasons. Think about that. Half your working week or more spent farming someone else's land for free, and your own crops still needed tending. Your own family still needed feeding. You did that in whatever time was left over. The corvée wasn't just field work. You might be required to haul timber, dig ditches, repair roads, cart stones, or maintain the Lord's buildings. Whatever the estate needed done, the serfs provided the labor for free with their own tools, on top of their own farming responsibilities. During harvest season, the demands intensified. Boon days were additional compulsory work days called by the Lord when extra labor was needed urgently. Even free peasants who otherwise owed minimal obligations were required to provide boon work during harvest. The crops in the Lord's fields had priority. If the weather turned and you had to choose between saving the Lord's harvest and saving your own, the Lord's harvest came first. Your family's food was secondary, but here is where it starts to feel truly suffocating. The Lord didn't just take your labor and a portion of your harvest. He controlled the infrastructure of daily life, and He charged you for using it. You had to grind your grain at the Lord's mill. It was illegal to use any other mill, or to grind your own grain at home with a hand quern. For this privilege, the miller kept a portion of your flour, roughly 1/20th, as the Lord's profit. The same applied to the Lord's oven. You had to bake your bread there, paying a fee each time. In France, this system was called the bannerlight, and it extended to the Lord's winepress, the Lord's brewery, and sometimes even the Lord's forge. Every essential service was a monopoly, and every monopoly was a tax. Now add the tithe. 1/10 of everything you produced went to the church, not to the Lord, to the church. That was a separate obligation entirely. 1/10 of your grain, 1/10 of your livestock, 1/10 of the eggs your hens laid, the wool your sheep produced, the fruit from your trees. The tithe had been established as far back as the 8th century, and by the 10th century, penalties for non-payment were enforced by law. The church was not a gentle creditor. Excommunication, the ultimate spiritual punishment, could be wielded against those who failed to pay. In a world where everyone genuinely believed in heaven and hell, where the church controlled access to the sacraments that determined your eternal fate, the threat of excommunication was as terrifying as any physical punishment. Pay your tithe or risk your immortal soul. It was spiritual extortion backed by genuine belief, and the church was itself one of the largest landowners in medieval Europe. Monasteries, abbeys, and bishoprics controlled enormous estates worked by peasants who owed the same feudal obligations as any lord's tenants. The abbots and bishops often sided with the secular nobility against the peasants, because their economic interests were identical. The institution that was supposed to comfort the poor was itself one of the institutions extracting wealth from them. So let's do the arithmetic. You farm your strip of land. Before you eat a single bite, you owe rent to the Lord. Then you owe 1/10 of what is left to the church. Then you've lost 2 to 3 days of labor per week to the corvée. Then you are paying fees to grind your grain and bake your bread. And we haven't even gotten to the special taxes yet. The tollage was a tax the Lord could impose at his own discretion whenever he needed money. Going to war. Tollage, building a new wing on the manor house. Tollage, marrying off a daughter. Tollage, there was no fixed rate, there was no schedule. The Lord simply decided he needed funds, and the peasants paid. By the 1300s, tallage was starting to become more standardized, levied once a year at a somewhat predictable rate. But for centuries before that, it was entirely arbitrary. You never knew when the demand would come or how much it would be. And then there were the life taxes. The ones that reached into the most personal moments of a peasant's existence. Merche was the fee a serf paid to the Lord for permission to marry off a daughter, not a blessing fee, not a church donation, a fee for the Lord's permission. Because as a serf, your daughter was technically the Lord's property and her labor had value. If she married someone from another manor, the Lord was losing a worker. Compensation had to be paid. The amount varied, but it could be substantial, sometimes equivalent to several weeks of income. Lehrweit was the fine imposed if a serf's daughter had a child outside of marriage. The Lord was entitled to compensation for the reputational damage, even though the Lord himself might face no consequences for fathering children with his own serfs. The hypocrisy was structural and absolute. And then there was Heriot, the death tax. When the head of a peasant family died, the Lord claimed the family's best animal, their best cow, their best horse, their best ox. The church then claimed the second best animal as a mortuary fee. In a single death, a family could lose the two most valuable creatures they possessed. And this happened at the worst possible moment, when the family had just lost its primary breadwinner. Picture this. Your father dies after years of working the land. Your mother is grieving. Your siblings are frightened. And before the body is even cold, the Lord's agent arrives to take your best cow, and the priest arrives to take the next one. Your family's two most productive animals, gone in a day, and you still owe rent next month. But even inheriting the land wasn't free. A fee called gesuma had to be paid to the Lord just to take possession of your dead father's tenancy. So the family that just lost its two best animals now also owed cash for the privilege of continuing to farm the land they'd lived on their entire lives. Grief was expensive in medieval England. If the serf wanted to send a son away for education or to enter the priesthood, that required a fee. If the serf wanted to sell an animal at market, the Lord received a portion of the sale price. A yearly wood penny was charged for the privilege of gathering firewood from the Lord's forest. At Easter, a peasant family might owe extra eggs. At Christmas, a goose, season after season, obligation after obligation. The demands never stopped, and you couldn't hunt. The forests belonged to the Lord. The deer, the boar, the rabbits, all of them were the Lord's property. If you were caught poaching, even if your family was starving, the penalties were savage: fines you couldn't pay, mutilation, imprisonment. In some periods and places, execution. You could watch fat deer walk past your cottage while your children went hungry, and touching one was a crime. There was one escape route technically. If a serf could reach a chartered town or royal demesne and live there for a year and a day without being reclaimed, he was legally free. The lord had 4 days to pursue a runaway serf. After that, recovering the serf became a legal battle that the courts increasingly tended to resolve in the peasants' favor. By the 1400s, English courts were making it more and more clear that serfdom was, as one legal commentator put it, repugnant to the law of England, but running away meant leaving everything behind. Your land, your cottage, your community, your family, if they couldn't come with you. Everything you'd ever known, and if you were caught before the year and a day expired, the consequences were brutal. The records that documented all of this were meticulously maintained. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086 by order of William the Conqueror, was essentially a comprehensive inventory of every taxable piece of property in England, every hide of land, every plough team, every mill, every fish pond. It told the king exactly what he owned and exactly what could be extracted from it. The medieval English called it the Domesday Book because, like the Last Judgment, there was no appeal from its verdicts. Now let's talk about what happened when the king needed money. Because everything we've discussed so far was just the local level. Above the lord sat the crown, and the crown's demands cascaded downward like water through a leaking roof. In England, the traditional royal tax was the geld, a land tax assessed on every hide of land in the kingdom. This was unique in Europe. It applied to all the king's subjects, not just his immediate tenants. When the king needed money for wars, which was constantly, the geld went up. When the king needed to ransom himself from captivity, as Richard I did in 1194, extraordinary levies were imposed. Richard's ransom required a 25% tax on all personal property and income 25%. On top of everything the peasants already owed. The Saladin tithe of 1188 was levied at 10% of all goods and revenues to fund a proposed crusade. The crusade taxes weren't optional. They weren't voluntary donations to a holy cause. They were mandatory extractions, enforced by royal officials who had every incentive to squeeze as hard as they could. And here is where the corruption enters, because the crown didn't have a modern tax bureaucracy. It relied on a chain of collectors, each taking their cut. The king assessed a total on a region. The local lord was responsible for collecting that total from his tenants. If the lord had paid the crown up front for the right to collect taxes in his territory, he was essentially left to his own devices. Whatever he collected above the required amount, he kept. The incentive to overtax was built directly into the system. At the village level, the reeve, a peasant appointed to manage daily operations, was often caught in the middle. He had to enforce the lord's demands on his own neighbors. He had to report who wasn't paying, who was shirking labor service, who had unauthorized grain mills hidden in their cottages. The reeve was universally distrusted, feared by his neighbors, and suspected by the Lord. It was a position nobody wanted, but somebody had to fill. The bailiff, a step above the reeve, represented the Lord's interests directly and oversaw the agricultural operations of the manor. He supervised planting and harvest, managed the Lord's livestock, and ensured that all rents and services were collected. If the harvest was poor, it was the bailiff who decided whether the Lord's granaries would be filled first, or whether the peasants' subsistence would be protected. The answer was almost always the granaries. Think about the Sheriff of Nottingham from the Robin Hood legends. That character resonated for centuries because he represented something real. Not necessarily one specific corrupt official, but a system that structurally enabled and rewarded corruption. The Crown had few regulations on how taxes could be collected. The people doing the collecting had every reason to take more than required, and the peasants at the bottom had no recourse, no appeals process, no ombudsman, and no rights. King John of England, who reigned from 1199 to 1216, became infamous for his heavy and arbitrary taxation. He demanded scutage, a tax in lieu of military service, 11 times during his 17-year reign. He imposed enormous fines on barons for minor offences. He squeezed every penny from every corner of his kingdom to fund his continental wars. The result was the Magna Carta in 1215, a document forced on John by his own barons that attempted, among other things, to limit the crown's power to tax without consent. But here is the thing. The Magna Carta protected the barons. It didn't protect the peasants. The clause that would have limited taxation required the consent of the Great Council, a body of nobles and churchmen. Ordinary people had no representation at all. The barons could now resist the king's demands. The peasants could not resist the barons. As the 13th century progressed, kings experimented with new forms of taxation. Edward I imposed a tax of 6 shillings and 8 pence on every sack of wool exported to other countries. Taxes on movable property required people to have their belongings valued by official assessors, then pay a percentage, usually around 10%, to the crown. This created enormous resentment because it felt invasive. Strange men arrived at your home, catalogued everything you owned, assigned values to your possessions, and sent you a bill. The wool tax devastated rural communities that depended on the wool trade. England's sheep were the backbone of its medieval economy, and taxing wool exports rippled outward through every village where sheep were raised. Peasants who had managed to improve their lot through the wool trade found themselves squeezed from yet another direction. So what happened when you couldn't pay? What happened when the harvest failed? When your animals died? When illness struck, and you simply didn't have enough? The consequences were severe and cascading. The Lord could seize your goods. He could take your remaining animals. He could fine you in the manorial court, adding debt on top of the tax you already couldn't pay. In extreme cases, you could be imprisoned. Your land could be forfeit, leaving your family homeless. The manorial court records that survive from this period are filled with cases of peasants fined for failure to perform labor service, for grinding grain at unauthorized mills, for failure to pay rent on time. The court itself was another source of revenue. The lord presided over the manorial court, or his steward did. Every fine, every penalty, every fee for settling disputes, all of it flowed to the lord. Justice wasn't free, it was another tax. The experience of France was equally crushing, and in some ways worse. French peasants faced the tile, which began as an occasional demand, but became a permanent annual tax under Charles V in 1364. It was paid exclusively by the Third Estate, the common people. The clergy and the aristocracy were exempt. The people who had the least paid the most. The people who had the most paid nothing. French peasants also endured the champart, a tax of 4 to 25% of the harvest, paid directly to the feudal lord, and the bannerlight, which forced them to use the lord's mill, oven, and wine press for a fee. The system was so grinding that French politicians actually proposed a remarkable justification for high taxation. They argued that increasing taxes would spur productivity, because to pay more, a person must produce more. The cruelty was dressed up as economics. The Jacquerie of 1358 was France's version of the Peasants' Revolt. Roughly 100,000 French peasants, artisans, small merchants, and even village priests rose up against the feudal lords. Their goal was to destroy the lords and live without masters, but with a good king. The revolt was brutally suppressed. Over 20,000 participants were executed, but the crown took note, and Charles V carried out tax reforms to systematize collection and establish oversight. And the psychological weight of all this was crushing. You never knew when the next demand would come. You never knew if this year's harvest would cover this year's obligations. You lived in a state of perpetual financial anxiety that modern people, with all our stress about mortgages and credit cards, can barely imagine. Because if you defaulted on a modern debt, you might lose your house. If a medieval peasant defaulted on his obligations, he could lose everything, including his freedom. If you are still with us, thank you. If you are drifting off, that is perfectly fine. These debts were settled a long time ago. Now, in 1348, everything changed. The Black Death arrived in England. The plague killed somewhere between a third and half of England's entire population. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Entire villages were wiped out. Fields went unplanted. Livestock wandered untended. The structure that had sustained medieval agriculture for centuries was shattered in months. The economic consequences were immediate and profound. Before the plague, labor was cheap and land was scarce. After the plague, the equation flipped completely. Land was abundant, labor was precious. A peasant who survived the plague found himself in a world where his work was suddenly worth far more than anyone had ever been willing to pay for it. And in the aftermath, something extraordinary happened. For the first time, the peasants who survived had leverage. There weren't enough workers to farm all the land. Lords who had never negotiated with anyone now found themselves competing for labor. Peasants demanded higher wages. Some simply walked away from their manors, and offered their services to lords who would pay more. The ruling class panicked. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and make it illegal for workers to demand more. It was essentially a law saying, "We know half the country is dead and you are desperately needed, but you must accept the same pay as before the plague." The law was widely despised and almost impossible to enforce. Enforcement of the statute fell to local justices of the peace, often the same landlords who benefited from keeping wages low. Workers who accepted higher wages were fined. Workers who left their employment without permission were fined. The system was nakedly designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many, and everyone knew it. For 30 years, the tension built. Lords tried to reimpose obligations that had lapsed during the plague. They attempted to convert free laborers back into serfs to save money on wages. The legal system controlled by the landed class generally cooperated with these efforts. The peasants seethed, and then came the poll tax. In 1377, the first poll tax was imposed, a flat-rate tax on every person in the kingdom. It was introduced to fund the 100 Years' War against France. And unlike previous taxes based on land or wealth, the poll tax hit everyone equally 4 pence per person. That might not sound like much, but for a peasant family earning about 1 groat per week, it was devastating. And it fell hardest on the poor, because 4 pence was a fortune to a labourer, but pocket change to a lord. A second poll tax came in 1379. This one was graduated, meaning the wealthy paid more. John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, paid £6, 13 shillings, and 4 pence. A poor peasant paid 4 pence. Better but still punishing for those at the bottom. And then in 1380, Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, pushed through a third poll tax. This time it was flat rate again, 12 pence per person over the age of 15. No allowance for married couples, no adjustment for poverty. Everyone paid the same, whether lord or labourer. John Wycliffe, a radical priest, gave a sermon that captured the fury of ordinary people. He argued that lords did wrong to poor men by unreasonable taxes, and that the poor perished from hunger and thirst and cold, and their children also. He said lords ate and drank poor men's flesh and blood. And John Ball, an itinerant priest who had been touring Kent giving open-air sermons against the tax, asked the question that would echo through centuries. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? If God had created all people equal, who gave the lords the right to take everything from the poor? The Archbishop had Ball arrested and imprisoned in Maidstone Castle, but the ideas couldn't be imprisoned. The anger had been building for generations. The poll tax was simply the spark. On May 30th, 1381, a tax collector named John Bampton arrived in the Essex village of Fobbing to investigate why people hadn't paid their poll tax. The villagers threw him out. When the Crown sent soldiers to restore order, the villagers threw them out too. What followed was the largest popular uprising in English history. Under the leadership of Wat Tyler, a former soldier, and inspired by John Ball's preaching, roughly 30,000 peasants marched on London. They didn't blame the 14-year-old King Richard II. They blamed his advisors, the corrupt officials, the tax collectors, the system that had squeezed them dry for generations. They burned manor houses and destroyed their records. This was deliberate. The manorial records were the legal documentation of their servitude. Destroy the records, and you destroy the proof of what you owe. The rebels toured the countryside on horseback, torching the parchment rolls that bound them to the land. They targeted lawyers and legal officials with particular fury, because these were the men who enforced the written bonds of serfdom. The rebels freed John Ball from Maidstone Prison at Blackheath, just south of London. Ball delivered one of the most famous sermons in English history. He preached that God had created all people equal, that the nobility had no divine right to rule, that the wealth of the church should be redistributed. 30,000 people listened. When they reached London, chaos erupted. The rebels stormed the Tower of London. They found Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had championed the poll tax, and Robert Hales, the royal treasurer. Both were beheaded on Tower Hill. They destroyed the Savoy Palace of John of Gaunt, the most hated nobleman in England. They killed 140 Flemish merchants. A chopping block was set up at Cheapside for executions. King Richard, just 14 years old, rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End. Wat Tyler presented the peasants' demands: reduce land rents, abolish the poll tax, free pardons for all rebels, end serfdom. Richard agreed to everything. 30 clerks began copying out charters of freedom for the peasants to take home. Most of the rebels went home, charters in hand, but Wat Tyler and about 30,000 others stayed. They weren't convinced. At a second meeting at Smithfield, Tyler presented even more radical demands. The Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, drew his dagger and slashed at Tyler. Tyler was pulled from his horse and killed. Richard rode directly toward the rebel army. He was 14. He shouted to them that he would be their leader, that they should follow him. Somehow, it worked. The crowd began to disperse. The revolt was over, and then Richard broke every promise he had made. He declared that agreements made under duress were invalid. The charters of freedom were revoked. Royal soldiers hunted down the rebel leaders. By November, at least 1,500 rebels had been killed. John Ball was executed. The feudal system continued, but something had shifted. The poll tax was never imposed again, not for another 600 years, until Margaret Thatcher tried it in the 1980s, and that too proved wildly unpopular. The Statute of Labourers couldn't hold back the tide. Over the following decades and centuries, serfdom slowly eroded. Peasants bought their freedom. Labour shortages forced lords to negotiate. The rigid feudal structure that had defined medieval life for centuries was cracking, slowly, painfully but irreversibly. The process took generations. It wasn't a clean break. It was a slow, grinding transformation, as the old feudal relationships were gradually replaced by wage labor and cash rents. By the late 1400s, the serf was being replaced by the tenant farmer and a small landowner, the corvée faded. The manorial courts lost their power. The Harriet and Mercier became relics of a dying system, but the memory lingered. The resentment of arbitrary taxation was baked into the culture of English-speaking peoples for centuries afterward. When American colonists protested no taxation without representation 300 years later, they were reaching back, consciously or not, to the same principles that John Ball had preached at Blackheath. The idea that taxation requires consent, that the governed must agree to be governed, didn't spring from nowhere. It was forged in the suffering of millions of medieval peasants who had no say in the obligations imposed upon them. And here is the thing that strikes me most about all of this. The medieval tax system wasn't just about money, it was about control. Every tax, every fee, every obligation was a reminder of your place. The Harriet, when your father died, said, "Even your grief belongs to us." The Mercier, when your daughter married, said, "Even your family belongs to us." The corvée, when you worked the Lord's fields, said, "Even your body belongs to us." The mill monopoly, when you ground your grain, said, "Even your bread belongs to us." It was a system designed to extract maximum value from human beings, while giving them just enough to survive and keep working. And it lasted for centuries, not because the peasants accepted it willingly, but because the alternative, rebellion, almost always ended in death. Almost always, because sometimes, just sometimes, enough people decided at the same time that they would rather die fighting than live on their knees. And even though the peasants' revolt of 1381 failed in its immediate goals, even though Richard broke his promises and the leaders were executed, the revolt proved something that could never be unproven. The people at the bottom had power. They had always had power. They just hadn't known how to use it yet. The next time you fill out a tax form, you might want to pause for a moment. Not because your taxes are pleasant, but because somewhere in the long arc between then and now, between a serf handing over his best cow and you clicking a button on a website, something changed. People fought and died so that taxation would require representation, so that the law would apply equally to lords and laborers, so that a man on horseback couldn't ride into your village and take whatever he wanted because a piece of parchment said he could. Those fights aren't over. They may never be over. But the next time you grumble about your taxes, remember the peasant who grumbled too, who watched his best cow led away after his father's funeral, who worked 3 days a week on another man's land for nothing, who paid a fee to grind his own grain and bake his own bread, who needed permission to let his daughter marry. He dreaded the tax collector, and eventually he did something about it. Sleep well tonight. Nobody's coming for your cow. Good night.